What's up, ceramic students? Welcome back to the studio. We're going to begin our soapstone carving project, and so we'll have to gather a few pieces that are in your art kit that we haven't seen in a little bit. The small piece of soapstone that we've cut, it's about 1.5 by 1.5 square or so, maybe up to about 1/4 of an inch thick. It's kind of slippery feeling. And then right away today, we'll need the 3 grits of sandpaper. Even if you have used some of the sandpaper already, you should have some remnants or remaining pieces of a piece of 120, 220, and 400 grit sandpaper. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we'll use that today. But let me just say a couple things about soapstone first, right? I've sort of milled these down to fairly standard, almost like geometric looking pieces, but when it's quarried, soapstone really doesn't look that much different than just sort of any old rock, right? This piece was quarried probably in most soapstone these days isn't getting picked up off the ground in the southwestern United States anymore. It's probably coming from overseas, but when this piece was quarried, it's probably coming off of much larger blocks. It's broken up and then shipped to, say, an art supply or a sculpture supply. And then because soapstone is so easily milled using even just simple tools like wood cutting tools, it has a flattened edge on it, right? And the flattened edge has sort of evidence of how this thing was cut. It has these diagonal straight lines. Now, if you pay really close attention on yours, a lot of the scratches or diagonal straight lines are put there by a saw, right? I actually just used a standard wood cutting saw to sort of segment all these things out and get them to you. And essentially, one of our first jobs will be to sand off or face both sides of this, right? We're going to take our 120 grit sandpaper and remove all of those grooves or scratches. I want to use this project as sort of a way to understand how to think about finishing a surface or polishing a surface. And because soapstone is so easy to work, it's not a stone in the sense, it's not like granite or limestone where we would be using chisels and files and things like that. We can just use standard woodworking tools and sandpaper to work it down. It's a really great piece to learn how to finish a surface to go from, say, rough sawn to a fine polish. We'll take it all the way from, say, a 120 grit sandpaper up through 400, and then if you want to, we can put a polish on it that's about 10 or 20,000 grit. We'll use Tripoli and Red Rouge or Jeweler's Rouge and on a buffing wheel to sort of bring a mirror finish to the surface. One of the great things about working with natural materials like soapstone is that you get all the sort of interesting, sort of hard to predict character like veins that run through and variations in color. Before we talk too much more about the finishing, let me just kind of give you a sense of where we're going to land with this project. We're going to take a little bit of a study into sort of fine carving and the fine carving that would go into wearable sculpture. So I want you to imagine, for example, where you might wear a piece of sculpted stone jewelry, or what you might be able to make for somebody else who does wear that. I have the materials available, some leather strapping and some clasps to do a pendant, like a necklace piece. If you'd like to do some earrings or a bracelet or something like that, we can also work out some of the detail on how you might approach the difference in projects or how the available soapstone that you have could be broken up and used for other various pieces. The piece that I'm going to be working on and demonstrating with you guys is going to be a necklace piece, a pendant piece. I'll just kind of give you a quick preview of it right now. I've already got it begun here, and I'll sort of walk us back up to this piece to give you a sense of how I got there. But since the very first thing we're going to do is facing this thing, let's talk about how to deal with all the dust, the inevitable dust that you're going to produce. Just about every time you sit down to work with your soapstone, you want to lay down some sort of catch-all sheet. Could be a sheet of plastic that you've got in your studio kit, or I'll also provide just these pieces of butcher paper. They're just going to be a really great way to sort of contain the dust that you produce. The material that soapstone is made out of, right, if we got up really close, is sort of a very talky feeling sort of schist. And what that produces, that dust that it produces as we sand it, is pretty fine, and if it gets up into the air, you're going to end up, breathing a lot of that in. And so at school, right, if we're, in school, we're doing the COVID mask thing, it's probably okay. If you're working at home, you very well likely might want to use something that's got a little bit better filtration, especially if you're kicking up a lot of dust. One of these 3M P100 masks has a little bit better particulate filtration for that kind of thing. But if you keep the sanding sort of to a minimum and it's not getting kicked up into the air, you probably can get away without wearing a mask. The 120 grit sandpaper that we're going to use first is sort of the roughest sandpaper. The 220 grit sandpaper is a little bit smoother, and the 400 sandpaper is the smoothest one, or the finishing edge. And because the very first things we need to get rid of off the surface of our soapstone are all these rough grooves, we'll use the coarsest sandpaper to do that. And when you sand, you almost immediately get the feeling of how much of this dust we're going to be producing. And if you use a piece of paper like this, it sort of captures that dust, and at the end of the studio day, you can just crumple up the butcher paper and throw it away. But even in just a couple of quick strokes on a sandpaper, you can get a sense for how quickly I'll be able to remove some of those deep scratches. After a few minutes sanding on 120, then you'll switch it up to 220, and the stone, right, starts to reveal all of its interesting sort of natural features, like its veins that run through. Eventually, when we take that stone up even higher to 400, it starts to reveal the true color of the stone. We're working with sort of a greenish hued stone at this point. So when I first give it to you, it's almost got a white feel to it, and as we put a finer and finer finish on that stone, it gets darker and darker and darker, and even more transparent, right? It starts to hold the light a little bit more. So right here, right, this is almost rough off the block, just barely sanded it with some 120. This piece has been sanded to 220, 400, and then this has been put on the jeweler's wheel and polished to about a 10 or a 20,000 grit, or we don't even really think about grits, we just say a jeweler's rouge, right? And so we'll have the option to sort of work that up to finer and finer and finer grits, essentially removing all of the scratches off the surface of the piece. Now, to make that a little bit easier to understand, it may be useful to talk a little bit more about some of these grooves that are actually cut in the surface. Now this feels relatively flat. I cut it with a saw on a block, right? But if you took a really close look, you'd see lots of sort of jagged saw-like teeth in the surface of that soapstone. So now we're talking about, like a microscopic level, so that when you run your finger along the top of the soapstone, you're really just running it over the top of a bunch of these sort of peaks, and not even getting down into the valleys. And as you gradually sand a little bit further and a little bit further into the piece, you're sort of knocking off these peaks, right? And gradually flattening the piece down. The reason that we're going to work with 120 first and gradually step our way up is that if we jumped right to the 400 grit sandpaper, all we would really do is sort of take care of just a bunch of these little peaks, and if we ever hoped to get down to this sort of nice flat layer somewhere down in here, right, where I've taken off all the peaks and the valleys, well, in order to get there with 400 grit sandpaper, I'm just going to take a ton of time to get there. It's a little bit easier to think of grits of sandpapers by sort of cutting away a lot of the big material, what we'll call hogging off the waste, and then as I get closer and closer to my finish line, upgrade, or I should say switch to those finer and finer grit sandpapers. If we were working with a material that was much harder, we couldn't get away with just a 3 grit step up. We couldn't jump from 120 to 220, and we especially couldn't jump from 220 to 400. We would have to include some middle grits, but soapstone is so soft that we can get by with a couple of simple grits here. So the very first task will be to face both of these surfaces completely down to a 220 grit sandpaper. Then we've got to actually start talking about what we're going to do, or how we want to think about the design of our piece of jewelry. So I recommend getting out some paper and just starting to sketch. Now, I'm basing my sketch, my concept, off of some early Celtic or even Norse wood carving, pieces, it's a simple braid form, and I'm going to do a pendant piece. And because the block that we've got is sort of square shaped, I'll probably get at least 2 tries at this, or 2 pendants. If I don't break one of them, I'll end up with 2 pieces. But because soapstone is so fragile, it's possible that if I'm not careful, I could crack it. And so I want to make sure that I actually give myself a little bit of time. So I did a bunch of drawings here to sort of figure out the way I want that braid to look, whether I want it tapered or not, figuring out all the detail. And I'm using photographic references for that. And eventually, I'm also using a little bit of computer assisted design to sort of help clean up the design. Because I use the computer, I also have the option of printing off my design and using a water-based adhesive to glue it down to the surface of the soapstone, so that then I can sort of draw right onto the surface with an X-Acto blade and transfer the design to the stone. Eventually, I will just melt the paper back off the surface using a bit of water, and then I'll get down to carving the stone. What I'll use to carve the stone are probably a series of saws to cut the shape of the stone down to the appropriate size that I need, sort of facing off some of these outer edges, using maybe an X-Acto knife to do some very fine scraping and scratching, or if I need to do any larger work, using a drill to put a hole through the design for the purpose of sort of having that having the leather strap fit through, or using a flat file or any other detail files to sort of help rough in the lines where I need. This is pretty slow work, guys, and so the plan would be maybe instead of jumping right into the stone itself, let's get our sketches down, and then we'll also use some ceramic clay as a bit of a mock-up. So I'll be using some ceramic clay to roll out a thin slab and practice my carving on a slightly larger piece. Clay is much more forgiving, and so we'll be able to make a few mistakes, practice our carving in clay, and then we'll come back to the soapstone piece. If you can kind of work all that fairly quickly, go ahead, but I imagine this taking probably about 2 weeks or so in order to go from start to finish. Our rough concepts to some drawings to a clay mock-up, and then our final soapstone. I look forward to seeing what kind of designs you guys come up with, and I'm happy to help you guys work through maybe a bit of research to see what might pique your interest. I'll catch up with you guys in the studio.